This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and we have a very interesting topic today we're going to take a look at, and that is management team challenges. And with me to sort of take a look at this topic is expert in this field, Steve Lukens, who's the National Managing Principal for Advisory Services for Grant Thornton. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Good to be here, TK.
Well, this is anytime you have a board, they've got to be concerned with all the issues and that management has to wrestle with, because eventually those work their way up, to the board level. And I understand that Grant Thornton has done a series of surveys sort of looking at the different segments and the different challenges. Talk to me a little bit about what you've seen emerge, talk a little bit about the studies, and then what you've seen come out of those.
Sure. On a regular basis, we survey key executives in various parts of the organization to understand what's on their minds and what are the things that they're spending most of their time focused on and worrying about for their organization. And just recently this year, we completed 3 surveys, one for the chief audit executive, so the internal audit primarily, the second one for the general counsel, and third for chief information officer. And one of the things we wanted to do was, since all 3 of these studies were taking place in the same time frame, is see if we could determine anything consistent across the 3 organizations or the 3 domains, if you will. And a couple of very interesting topics popped up in all 3 areas. The one area that was resoundingly a big issue was just the regulatory impact. And so whether you're talking about internal audit, you're talking about general counsel, you're talking about chief information officer, the impact and uncertainty around regulation, what that means, and how much time their organizations spend focusing on various regulatory issues.
Isn't that even worse for small companies? Big companies have all these resources to throw out regulatory issues. Small companies, you got to feel for them.
Exactly. And so a small and mid-sized company, particularly with a relatively diverse business, would come under all of these different regulations, from labor laws to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to the new Affordable Health Care Act, and just on, depending on what industry you're in. And the general counsels cited with a very strong percentage, the number one threat that they saw to their business was regulatory issues, and that's where they were focusing on. And we were kind of stunned by that, because you would expect a business's number one threat to come from the competition, or at least the economy, if not a competitive or a new product entry. So the fact that the general counsels are spending that much time and really concerned about the regulatory impact is something very interesting and possibly alarming.
Yeah. So what else did the survey show you after the regulatory?
Well, it's a bit related to regulatory, and this comes starting with the chief information officer. The need to understand and have capability around data analytics. We hear a lot about big data, we hear business intelligence, there's a lot of buzzwords thrown around. But if you take that down to kind of a practical level of day-to-day running the business, many of the elements that the internal audit group works on, the general counsel works on, relies on collecting data about the operations of the business, and the employees, where revenue comes from, who are your customers, know your customer, anti-money laundering. And so the key to responding to many of the regulations and regulatory threats lies in data. And data and the analysis of that information it really needs to be, is provided by and supported by the Chief Information Officer or the IT department, whatever it's called. And again, in the small and mid-sized businesses, the IT departments are not necessarily geared up to support some of the analytical requests that come up from these regulatory drivers.
You know, in that space, when we look at from a director's point of view, they're probably not as sensitive to the regulatory because that part doesn't hit them quite as much as it does management. But cybersecurity in that space that you're talking about that's affiliated with the big data, that was a huge concern of the board of directors.
Yeah, and in order to deal with cybersecurity, to deal with privacy, to deal with the analytics, to just get the information about the business and about performance, requires technology. And what we're seeing, many of our clients, they're struggling with how to fund the investments to buy, implement, and roll out this kind of technology that's required, both for driving the performance of your business as well as responding to some of the internal requirements that come from regulatory reporting.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about how management is dealing, from your perspective, how management is dealing with this. Is there anything else, though, that we need to identify before we move on to?
Well, I think those are two of the topics, and really understanding how those pieces, regulatory and data analytics, fit together in order to respond to a lot of the requests that come from the various agencies. So that combination of those two things that cross not only the general counsel, internal audit, information technology, but then HR and operations. It really spans the entire functional array inside an organization.
So your team, your advisory services team, they have responsibility to go in and help management deal with these issues. So how's management doing? How do you think companies today are dealing with those two monster issues? Okay.
What we've noticed, not only from the surveys but from our clients, is that we're not seeing the approach, the response to regulation and data analytics being a holistic response. It's more siloed by each of the different areas, so that the legal community is dealing with responding to the requests and understanding the responses. Internal audit is executing their work plans and going through and understanding what regulatory compliance issues that they need to check up and audit in the course of their work. And then IT is providing data, sort of tossing data across the wall. And what we're not seeing, and what we would recommend board members think about, is how do you get the various different functions in your organization, regardless of the size, in a large organization or a small one, getting together and addressing these issues from the beginning, as opposed to kind of responding to each other when you're in the midst of dealing with either a situation when you're in violation of a regulation, or that there's a clamor to get some information out to respond to a deadline that's coming up very shortly.
I assume that challenge, though, is not a unique challenge. I assume that's a challenge for any growing institution on how do you get sort of the 30,000-foot look at how all these problems interrelate and how should we handle that.
It is. It's not a new problem, but because of, in my mind, two things it's made worse in recent years. One is just the speed at which things change. Right? Stuff is changing very quickly. The requests from the regulators are coming in. A news bulletin pops up that a competitor just got in trouble over something, and the CEO or the board's asking a question. The expectation is that all the functional execs need to respond very, very quickly. So that puts a lot of pressure on the need to collaborate across these areas. And then also just the advent of technology. There's so many different types of technology, and everybody's gotten so used to having things at their fingertips with their iPad or their iPhone or whatever, that making sure that all these different pieces of technology fit together, so when you ask a question about information, you get a single source of the truth, and you don't have 5 different answers, and then you have to figure out which one is right.
Well, it's not hard to imagine how overwhelming it is for the board okay, and particularly if you've got 50 businesses in 50 countries, that's you're having to look at the summary of that. So, one of the things we try and do on the show is sort of offer advice. So, what questions do you think that directors should be asking, sort of to get a feel on particularly these two areas, on the challenges that management has relative to this, to give themselves some comfort?
Well, from an overall governance and risk management perspective, asking the question, where are we most at risk from a regulatory environment? And what's coming down the road? What's new? What is it that we don't understand enough about yet? And I suggest a frequent answer to that question right now is going to be the Affordable Health Care Act. I don't think the legislators who wrote it all entirely know what's in there. And the more we work with understanding what the implications are, there's a lot of sort of seems like common sense rules at the top, but then when you dig down, realizing that a subcontractor might be considered an employee for purposes of the Affordable Health Care Act, and then try to figure out how many subcontractors you have in your business that count according to the rules that you then have to pay a certain amount for on an annual or quarterly basis. And in my business, we use subcontractors all the time. And it's not clear that anybody has a handle on how many there are at any given time. And the larger the organization, the more difficult it is to capture that kind of information. And the deadlines for compliance are coming up very quickly. And so not only do you have the internal audit folks worried about that, the HR directors are worried about it, the IT people are scrambling trying to respond. So asking your management team, where are you in terms of getting out ahead of some of these, realizing that these things, the regulations change very quickly, and some might not affect every, conflict minerals might not affect every company. But there are a lot of issues, and they're changing quickly, and having your management team out ahead is key. The second area that I would suggest directors ask about is, how are we investing in information technology that's going to allow us to provide intelligence about our business in the future? So data analytics, data mining, business intelligence, it takes time to implement that technology, and it's relatively expensive, and there's a lot of options out there. So every organization should have some strategy as to how they're going to get the information they need to manage the profitability, the effectiveness of their sales force, lots of different dimensions of that kind of business intelligence. Your competition is probably out there getting further down the line, using cloud technologies and using all the different changing technology that's out there, and just having a handle on what's the roadmap, what's our strategy over the next 1 to 3 years in terms of keeping up with what we need, and not finding yourself at a competitive disadvantage and needing to spend millions of dollars to just catch up.
And that takes me back to my previous comment. Isn't that especially challenging for mid-size or small cap companies when you just don't have the resources to, take away from your day-to-day operating and spend so much time in that particular area? It
is, and it's even more difficult today in those companies, because we see, as the mid-sized companies are chasing growth, they're looking for ways to grow in an uncertain and unstable economy here in the U.S. Many are expanding overseas. And if you aren't buying and setting up operations in China or in Asia or in Europe or Africa or wherever, your suppliers are offshore, are global. So suddenly, not only do you have all this reporting and analytics, but the span of where that data is coming from could span time zones around the world, and the complexity of getting that information in a timely manner and responding to the authorities is even worse. And to your point, a small and mid-sized company, as they do expand globally, are even more challenged because they don't have the natural infrastructure to do that.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we've just been able to touch probably on a lot of the management challenges, but certainly, Steve, it sounds like those are the big ones. And I'm sure those questions to our viewers will be helpful. That's a good place to start, at least to start to get your arms around that. So I want to thank you for joining us on this. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week where we look at another critical board topic or committee topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.